So we thought we'd take a minute just to introduce ourselves. There's two of us that will be co-facilitating the workshop today. Myself, I'm Rebecca Gokert, and then Peter on my screen, he's just to the right of me. We've also got Rochelle Tong from the Alberta Mentoring Partnership, and she'll do some context setting for us today. And Kirsty Keys on the far right is a student that's joining us on this project. And we're lucky to have Andrew, who is with the Alberta Mentoring Partnership, to support us with any technological issues. So I see that there is a question already in the chat, and Andy's going to be kind of monitoring the chat just so Peter and I can focus today. But the first question was, will this be recorded? So we would like to record it just so that we can share it on the AMP website as well as on our website. And so we're hoping that people are okay with that. If you're not comfortable with your face or your video, then we just encourage you to turn that off. Does anybody have a problem with recording? Maybe just at this point, let us know. You can let us know in the chat, or thumbs down as a reaction. Is that a reaction? I should probably check.
Yeah, I don't think
only thumbs up or clapping.
Zoom only allows you to do thumbs up, I think.
That's right. No negative reactions, only positive stuff today. Okay. So I'll just introduce myself. My name is Rebecca Gokert, and I'm with the Community University Partnership for the Study of Children, Youth, and Families. We're fondly known as CUP, and we're at the University of Alberta. And I am leading something called the Evaluation Capacity Network. So I get really excited to talk about evaluation and learn alongside organizations and individuals about evaluation. And I'll let my colleague Peter share just a bit about himself.
Sure. Hi there. My name's Peter. So I'm new to the Evaluation Capacity Network. I joined in the end of May, and I'm now a postdoctoral fellow, helping to support the network and its development. And I'm very excited. I was with government before for about 12 years. And then when the opportunity came to work at the Community University Partnership for at least a little while, I jumped at the opportunity just because of the exciting work we do. And it's wonderful to work at the intersection between university and community. So hi, everybody.
Great, thanks, Peter. And then I'm going to hand it over to Rochelle with AMP so she can introduce herself, a little bit about AMP, and maybe kind of tee us off here today.
Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, I'm Rochelle, and I'm here with Alberta Mentoring Partnership. I work for the Government for Children's Services, but a portion of my role is supporting AMP. And for those of you, I'm not sure if everyone here is completely familiar with AMP, but we are an umbrella organization that helps to support mentoring service providers across the province. So that really represents a large variety of different organizations. So some of them set up pretty much with the intention of providing mentoring to children and youth. Like you probably can think of Boys and Girls Clubs or Big Brothers Big Sisters as one of those type of organizations, and other organizations that have some sort of mentoring service embedded in their program. So that can be schools or YMCA, 4-H, different organizations. So yeah, that's kind of who we represent. We don't provide any direct mentoring, but we do provide training opportunities like this one and other sorts of resources and supports to those organizations. So I'm really excited about this opportunity we have here today. I'm really interested in evaluation as well, and so I think there's going to be some really good information here. And I know Rebecca and Peter are so engaging and interested in their topic that it'll be really awesome learning opportunity. So thanks for all joining us. And if anyone is curious to learn more about the Alberta Mentoring Partnership, you can go to albertamentors.com and albertamentors.ca and sign up for our newsletter and keep informed about the other events and things that we have coming up. Thanks, everyone.
Great, thanks, Rochelle. So I'm going to share my screen because we do have a PowerPoint. Let me see if I can do this properly. yet. Okay, can everybody see that okay? I'm gonna just get myself organized with the tile so I can see all the names. Awesome. Okay, so of course we are running this in a virtual format. So I just wanted to go through a little bit of kind of workshop netiquette. We just wanted to, highlight a few rules. And I think obviously everybody is now pretty well accustomed to being online, participating in meetings and that. So you all got online and you muted right away, which is fantastic. Just ensuring that you've got a nice quiet space for participating. I had to sort of warn my family they were not allowed to interrupt me today, but there could be the odd little person that runs into my room. We ask that you're respectful of all learners in the workshop. We actually have a nice kind of smaller group today, so we might be able to do a little more engagement rather than just using the chat function, but that could change over time as the numbers increase. So I would encourage you to keep your microphone on mute unless you have a question or you've got a point of clarification, just so we don't get any background noise. If you need to take a break, either from your video or just need to step away for a minute, we totally understand. We ask that you use the chat function. I think people are already doing that. If you've got any questions, we do have Andy kind of supporting us. So if there's any technological issues that you run into, if you've got any questions, Peter and I will be kind of monitoring for each other as we facilitate, so we can make sure that we get your questions answered. And yeah, I think that's it. And we can sort of launch right into it. I need to advance my screen. Okay, so for today, our goal is that we're going to be focusing on kind of three main areas when we talk about evaluation. We're going to talk about what it is, why it's important, and how you and the organizations that you represent can conduct or support evaluations. So we've got a short amount of time together. It might seem like a lot from 9 to noon, but I think it'll go by fairly quickly. Peter and I are going to be sharing slides, but we don't want to be doing all of the talking. So we certainly want to figure out different ways that we can engage you in conversation. We're going to be doing a few little breakouts, so you'll be broken out into a Zoom room and you'll take care of that. I think for the most part, you sit back and you get moved in and out of rooms, but if anything goes wrong, just go back to that original Zoom link and we'll make sure that you're back in the session. We also have a few polls or questions that we'd like you to answer throughout the day, just so that we can get some kind of rapid feedback about where you're at and your thoughts on some different topics. And then we will invite you to answer some questions or pose questions to us, either through the chat function, or feel free to ask the questions too. And you can turn your video on, keep it off. It's completely up to you. And we will, of course, check in kind of at that midpoint to see, who needs a break. Probably Peter and I will need to grab a glass of water or something like that. So we'll take about a 10-minute break just to reset. Okay, so just to get started, Peter and I shared a little bit about ourselves, but we'd like to get to know you a little bit. So Andy's got some polls. We're quite interested in knowing where you're located in the province. We're interested in knowing what kind of organization you represent. Is it on the smaller side? Is it larger? What type of mentoring do you engage in? Perhaps not all of you are mentoring type organizations or individuals, and so we're curious about that. And then also, what's your experience with evaluation? So if you can just complete that first question there, where are you located? And I even get to respond. So Andy, you'll have to share that when it's, okay, so the bulk of people are in Edmonton and Calgary. We've got a couple others. So other on the list. In Alberta, I'm assuming, but perhaps not. Does anybody want to share where they're from? Anywhere exciting? You're perhaps joining us remotely from a different province. Okay, and then our next question is, do you represent a large or a small organization somewhere in between? Perhaps you're not even with an organization. And Andy, if you can share those results. Okay, so kind of all over the place. We've got some small organizations. I selected small. I don't actually really know what would constitute small because I think we've got about 30 staff. So maybe we're more in the medium zone, but kind of across the spectrum in terms of large and small organizations. Okay, and then our next question is, what type of mentoring do you engage in within your organization or individually? Okay, so we've got about, I actually responded none of the above. I do lots of mentoring in my work, but not formal mentoring. So we've got a combination of virtual, after school, all of the above. And I'm just curious if people can share where they're from, if they're not within the mentoring field. And I've got the chat here. Okay, we've got some folks from Red Deer, Claresholm, Saskatchewan. So what kinds of organizations? I see, Betty, you're with linkages, maybe some recreation programs. Oh, Center for Autism. So kind of a nice blend of different learners here today. That's fantastic. So I'd love to hear from you what your experience with evaluation is. Are you kind of on the very little experience, or are you on the other end of the spectrum where you are an internal evaluator with your organization, or somewhere in between? Maybe you have some knowledge about it, but you've never had to do it, or you've never had to kind of supervise an evaluation. So I'd just like to understand where you're positioned. Okay, so again, lots of variability from very little experience all the way to I'm an internal evaluator. So certainly we hope that for some of those folks with very little experience, we'll be able to set a bit of a foundation. And Peter and I are going to be sharing an orientation to evaluation that we use fairly regularly, which is community-based evaluation. But there are lots of different approaches to evaluation. And then we might lean into some of those internal evaluators from the organization to share some of your experiences from your work as well. So don't be shy. I feel like I'm just talking to lots of names right now, but I look forward to hearing from you as well. Okay, so moving right along. So because we're kind of a small number, some people can probably just do popcorn style here, but if you want, you can just share your thoughts in the chat function. So I'm just curious, what comes to mind when you hear the word evaluation, or what is evaluation to you?
For me, it's measuring our outcomes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Betty. Measuring outcomes. We've got feedback, assessment. Other things that come to mind? Gathering information, ensuring goals are met. That same idea of outcomes, checking in with participants. Learning, growth. I love these responses. Usually when I put evaluation, people sort of have like sometimes a visceral negative reaction to it. So judgment. So obviously you've had some good experiences, even for those with very little experience with evaluation, that it isn't, it's not necessarily a dirty word.
I even see, Rebecca, somebody saying including voice in outcomes, which I think is a fairly powerful statement as well.
Yeah. That's great. Okay, well, I think we're definitely all on the same page here in terms of the orientation that Peter and I will be talking about today, from, you know, including voice, participation. People were using the word engagement. So here's kind of just a basic definition. So evaluation is an organized or systematic approach to collecting information. Could be about activities, impacts, effectiveness, outcomes, that helps to improve a program or an organization and describe its accomplishments. And you'll notice that I included the word improve in this definition versus prove. Some people sort of think of it as on that spectrum of improve versus prove. And so I definitely come from an orientation where I always think the purpose of evaluation should be learning oriented, should be to improve programs, or practices, to describe accomplishments, and, you know, to keep doing things that are working well, or to really sort of reflect on what we're learning and taking a step back and saying, what do we need to modify here to make sure that we're offering the best, you know, quality program for our clients, or that our organization is meeting its goals in the ways that we anticipated. Okay, so we've got another poll here. So this is when we run an actual physical workshop, we would get you all finally to get up out of your desks, although we haven't been sitting for too long yet, and we would do a human Likert. And so what that is we get you all to kind of line up, and as you can see on the right hand side of your screen, we've got strongly disagree, and on the left hand side we've got strongly agree. And so the question that I'd like you to respond to is, evaluation always makes programs better. So what are your thoughts around that? Okay, so nobody strongly disagrees that evaluations always make programs better, but we have some folks in the strongly agree, some disagree. So I'd like to kind of hear from those extremes. I'd love to hear somebody share with me, why did you select strongly agree that evaluations always make programs better? I'm going to put you on the spot. And you can share it. You don't have to chat if you want to unmute and share your thoughts. So somebody said, depends on how it's done. There's a lot of variables involved. Depends on variables measured and who's driving the selection of what is measured. Does anybody want to share that said strongly agree? Silence.
I will share for a second.
Okay, sure.
I think if we listen to participants, either like the volunteers that participate or facilitators, if we listen and find out what their needs are and find out if we're meeting them or if we're going astray somewhere, if we are good listeners, we will always be able to improve.
Great. Thank you, Betty. Anybody in that sort of neutral zone? So why did you select, I don't agree, I don't disagree, I'm kind of somewhere in the middle. And I see a few in the chat box, it depends, it depends, it depends. Does anybody want to share their thoughts?
I'll share what I said. I think I was in that sort of
Sure.
category. I was thinking that the process of evaluation, I think, automatically improves things a bit because we think about what we're doing more and then we adjust and make changes. But I think it's most impactful when the leadership is on board with the evaluation and that they're prepared to make decisions and modify things or make adjustments based on what we learned through the evaluation. So if that piece isn't there, I think it's a challenge for the process of evaluation to make as much difference as it could.
Great. Thanks, Rochelle. So that idea of evaluation use, right? If we just gather the information, but we don't have a plan, a process, or the people in place that can actually use that information to make those improvements, changes, shifts, then we can't always make programs better. I'm curious, we had a few disagrees. What are your thoughts on that disagree? We have a shy group today, I think.
I'll comment. I was in the middle. I didn't agree or disagree. I guess in my experience, what I've found the most useful is making sure you're selecting variables that are meaningful to the individuals that you're serving and the staff, and also for data collection to make sure that it isn't cumbersome or overwhelming to staff, and ensuring that they get looped back in regularly so they're always receiving feedback about why they're completing some of these measures, and they can see the impact over time of what they're doing. And generally that gets them much more engaged and involved in the process, I've found.
Great, thanks for sharing, Jody. And I noticed somebody up kind of on the same lines, Rochelle, as what you were saying, and Jody disagreed. It doesn't always make programs better, especially if we do the evaluation, but we don't actually use the information that we gather. And I think that's, you know, perhaps a frustration that lots of people experience. But you've all kind of articulated in the chat or in some of your comments that evaluation really depends on lots of things, right? Many of which we're going to discuss over the course of today.
I think it's also interesting, Rebecca, just from the standpoint, because I think it's starting to also reveal that context matters.
Mm-hmm.
And the commitments we make to communities and to stakeholders as part of that evaluation process matters as well. So, which I think we're going to get into a little bit more later, but
Yeah.
But I noticed a little bit of that nuance coming out in some of the comments as well.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Peter. So there are several ways that we can approach evaluation, and I've already sort of told you our orientation, which is what we're going to share today, and that's a community-based approach to evaluation. I really like to think about evaluation on a continuum. So there are lots of approaches, and again, as Peter kind of mentions, it really depends on the context, right? Because we need to align our approach to evaluation based on the context in which we're in. So typically when I'm working alongside organizations or projects, I like to take a community-based or a participatory kind of collaborative approach, and that's what we're going to share today, is kind of walking through that approach and how that may or may not fit for your organization, your evaluation needs. And these are kind of two dichotomies here. We've got expert kind of based evaluation all the way to community-based, and there's a lot across that spectrum. So from an expert-based kind of perspective, that can be external, that can be imposed often, where, you know, somebody is coming in to evaluate your program. One individual kind of holds the expertise. They may or may not engage the organization, the participants, the folks that are kind of have a stake in the evaluation. So it's really kind of that, you know, external evaluation. It could be, though, that the organization hires an external evaluator, and that evaluator may still have a different kind of orientation, all the way to the much further end of the spectrum, which can be fairly participatory or empowerment oriented, where you're doing the evaluation in collaboration with participants, with the folks that are offering programs, that are quite curious about their practices. Yeah, so our orientation, as I've already sort of alluded to, is community-based. That's what we're going to share today, but that does not dismiss the fact that there is a role for all kinds of approaches of evaluation, and really it depends on the context and what you need the evaluation for. So, you know, sometimes we're responding to funder requirements, sometimes we are responding to understanding what's within the context that we're working. We're trying to know if a model is working so that we can perhaps you know, roll that up, scale that up, those types of things. So again, it's about kind of picking the approach based on the resources, the capacity that you have. And I know often, although we've got some internal evaluators, so that suggests some of the organizations have capacity around evaluation, often this is something many people are doing off the side of their desk. So it's not, you know, it's not necessarily in your job description. It's something that gets added to your job description once you get the job. So we're hoping that we can share some ideas about how we can make that a little bit easier. Okay. So as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about a community-based approach to evaluation. And so I might refer to this as CBE throughout the day. This does tend to be a more collaborative approach, participatory or stakeholder engaged form of evaluation. So this approach involves active participation of stakeholders in all phases of the evaluation, right from kind of planning, identifying what the purpose of the evaluation is, what kinds of questions you want to ask, the methods you would use, the data collection, even the process of how you gather information and who you gather information with and from, how you analyze and make sense of that information, and then ultimately how you mobilize and use those findings so that you can learn and make shifts to practices, programs, policies, organizational kind of goals and orientations. So the stakeholders really drive the evaluation and they're deeply engaged. There is the aim of producing results for positive change or some kind of change. So we're not just producing results to write a report for somebody else and you know, that might sit on a shelf, but it really is about taking a learning orientation to saying, what do we need to gather this information for, and how might we use that to learn and make shifts in our practices and programs. And then of course, as I mentioned, it can also be on a spectrum, and even from a community-based approach can really be on a spectrum as well, from being more community-based to less community-based. And I would say that that's really about the degree of participation. Peter, I'm going to rely on you to be checking the chat and either responding or stopping me if there's any questions. I've got two screens going, so.
No, I am keeping an eye on it.
Awesome.
For you.
I'm getting technological overload. Okay, so when we're talking about a community-based approach to evaluation, maybe I'll just get, well, thumbs up. We don't have a hands up. We have clap. Well, my reaction options are those. But I'm just curious if people heard about this approach to evaluation, if you just want to give a thumbs up, or I guess no response if you haven't heard that. Okay, so we've got lots of thumbs up. Okay, so a few non-responders, so perhaps this is new, a new approach, you've never heard of it before. Well, essentially there are three goals to community-based evaluation. So it's really about, as I mentioned, kind of that stakeholder, participatory, collaborative kind of orientation. So it's really about engaging people. So it's working in a relational way or working in relationship or partnership. So involving stakeholders. And we're going to talk a little bit about what is a stakeholder, who are stakeholders. So this can be participants. So in the case of mentoring, it would be children, youth, families, the schools, the community organizations, the staff, researchers, funders. It's learning oriented. It's another goal to community-based evaluation. So it's really about understanding what is working, what's not working, and what needs to be modified, quite simply. Understanding kind of the current programs that we're using around mentoring or whatever your context might be, and is that really working for the particular participants that you're working alongside? And then sharing results so that they can be used. So recognizing that many stakeholders surround an evaluation. There are those sort of internal participants, but there's also external and more broader kind of community or policy oriented stakeholders that may be may be interested in the findings, may have a role to play in kind of impacting the programs that many of you are involved in through your organizations. Okay, so I'm just going to pause here for a minute. We want to walk through a case study and unpack one over the course of today, just so that we have sort of a foundation that we can keep referring back to. And so we selected a case study from a project that I was involved in for several years. And it's called, we called it the Tara Brentwood Project, or the TB Housing Project. Some of you may be familiar with it. This may be new to you. You may know some of the organizations like the Tara Center or Brentwood Housing Development Organization. So we'll walk through a few different activities over the course of today. And so what I'd like to do, I'm not sure if you got this document in advance, but what Andy's going to do is put a link whenever we have a document that we want you to take a look at. So he's put a link in the chat box, and it's to a Google Doc. And it's just sort of a brief description. I think it's about 1.5 pages, 2 pages, just describing this particular project and case. So we want to get you to take a moment and review the case handout. And as you're reviewing it, just think through what are the issues that might need to be evaluated in this particular case? What might the purpose of evaluation be? In reading this, what did you learn about the community or the context that this evaluation will have to take place in? So we're just going to, it says we need, okay, so Andy, they need permission to access this Google Doc. I wonder if we have to go in and give permission for that.
I'm going to try to put the doc as a PDF inside the chat box too. So let's just see if we can do that. And
Okay.
that will hopefully eliminate the need to, but I just need to, that seemed easier to do than, just give me a second here.
So maybe I'll just ask, is anybody familiar
Sure.
with the TB project? Have you heard of this project? Hannah? One thumbs up. Probably many of you are familiar with Tara Center, which is an organization that supports pregnant and parenting teens. So Peter, I can also share my screen.
No, I'm doing it right now.
Oh, you are? Okay.
Yeah, it's just,
Oh, there we go.
it's just moving from too many screens at once. There you go. Somebody's done it for us.
Oh, look at that.
It's the challenge of having 14 screens up at once, not knowing where you are anymore.
I know, and I've got 2 computers going too.
I know.
So maybe just give us a thumbs up if you have access to the document, and if for some reason that's not working, we can also just bring the, okay, we've got some thumbs up happening. So take your time and just review that, and then we're going to, we're just going to discuss that as a group. And if anybody is having challenges, just shoot us a chat and we can share it. Gone are the days when we could just hand out a piece of paper.
I'm feeling nostalgic for flip charts at the moment as well.
Maybe just give us a thumbs up when you've had a chance to read it, just so we know when to. I don't want to rush people. Peter, I don't know if you can share on your screen.
Or what would you like me to do?
Well, just somebody, Nakarla is struck. Oh yeah, Susan can't open it either.
Oh, is this because of the PDF?
I don't know.
Let me see if it'll open at my end here and see if that works. It does seem to work at my end. It's a PDF, and so I'm not sure if it's that some people don't have Acrobat on their computers. I mean,
You know what I'll do?
we can give people a verbal update on, if you wanted to, give a sort of a verbal snapshot of what the housing program is. It's pretty easy to explain.
Yeah, and I'm just I'll just open it up here.
Do you want me to share my screen with that?
Oh, it's okay. I've got it here.
You got it. Okay,
yeah.
Awesome.
So I think people should be able to see this. So for those of you that didn't get a chance to review, maybe give it a read now. For those of you that have already kind of read through it, I am curious to hear your thoughts. What do you think the issues are in reading this case study? You can use the chat function, or you can just share your thoughts.
So Rebecca, there was a question, if you want to just further clarify, there was a question regarding issues in regards to what?
Yeah, so as we read, well, the header is the issue, but as we read this, so this organization came to me and said, you know, we've got this issue around safe, secure, supportive housing for teen families. We want to be able to provide that because they are currently lacking that. So they're living in unstable, unsafe housing with their children. And so it was two organizations that got together. So Brentwood said, we can offer subsidized, safe, secure housing. And Tara said, we can offer wraparound supports for these young families. So they kind of came together and said, well, we've got this model that we think we can implement. We think it's successful, but is it working? So I guess the issue based on that would be a lack of safe, secure, affordable housing for teen families. What do you think might be the purpose of evaluation in that particular situation? So we've got two organizations partnered together, offering what they consider to be a unique model of service delivery. What might be the purpose of evaluating that particular initiative?
So we do see some answers appearing here.
Mm-hmm. So making sure teen parents and children's needs are met would be to determine if the young parents feel safe, are able to afford the housing, and are feeling connected to the community. Successful transition to housing in private sector, establish personal and social supports. Excellent. So lots of pieces, right? If we're interested in safe, secure, affordable housing, we're interested in healthy child outcomes for the parents as well as for their children. It's really understanding how is that model contributing to that. So many of the comments here about determining if the teens themselves feel safe, if they're affording the housing, if they're getting connected to the community, are their needs being met? So Jody actually shared that idea of successfully transitioning into housing in the private sector. So whether you're in a subsidized supportive housing kind of model, can you actually transition out of that, or do you stay within that model as well? Could be process and outcome methodology. Yeah, excellent. Establish independence, have the parents address their own complex needs so that they have a voice. So really kind of wrapping supports around those families to see, you know, how can they kind of, like an empowerment model, right? Which is essentially the wraparound approach, which you would have seen in the write-up here. Yeah, supporting them and moving forward in their journey of independence. Excellent. So, and I think we're getting a lot at kind of the context here too, in terms of some of the comments too. So what's really interesting is these two groups. So it was the executive director of Terra and the executive director of Brentwood Housing essentially got together. The housing guy said, I want to support young families and children. Of course, Terra said, we've got young families and children that need housing. And so they came together. And they said, we've got this unique model and we know that it's effective. Can you evaluate it for us? And I said, okay, like this sounds really interesting. So we sat down as a group and we said, okay, you know, describe to us your model. And so they said, well, we do these kind of things. We've got these kinds of activities. Here are some of the things that we offer in housing. So actually, they didn't necessarily have a full model. They had some ideas around what should be contained in that model, but they were really just coming together in partnership. So what we decided to do was get together and do what we considered was the most appropriate approach, which was a developmental approach to evaluation, because they were essentially building a model of supportive housing. When we started diving into the literature specifically around teen families and housing, there was nothing. So we could not find any other, we could find supportive housing models more in sort of a, like a group home kind of context, shared living, but we couldn't find any supportive housing model. So we had nothing to lean into to say, yes, your model already exists. So this was really quite unique, that this collaboration. And so we were all kind of launching on this journey together to figure out, of all the activities you've listed that you are doing currently, or the services and the resources you're offering to families, are these the kinds of things that you should be? Is this the nice sort of, are these all of the ingredients that should be in this supportive housing model? So we walked alongside them to do a developmental evaluation to really shape what is this model of supportive housing. So there's lots of things in the context, obviously. So we're dealing with, or maybe I'll ask the group, what are some of the kind of contextual issues, just in terms of the participants themselves, the nature of the organizations. So somebody brought up kind of the trauma-informed idea as well. So thinking about the participants themselves, we've got young parents. They have experienced, many of them have experienced trauma. Any other thoughts on the context?
What I find interesting there too is that I think people are already hinting, Rebecca, what I find interesting is also not just thinking about the model in terms of activities that might be part of a model, but principles and values that might underpin the work. And so it seems like people are already hinting at the fact that a model might also need to include, for example, some values around inclusivity and how do we deal with trauma.
Yeah. And that's part of wraparound supports, right? In terms of the principles that guide how they're offering the supports. And interestingly, you've got two organizations that actually come from very different perspectives. So one is a housing organization, and that's what they're really, really good at. And the other organization is really good at supporting teen families, right? So now you've got two folks coming together to try to offer collaborative supports for teens, but coming from kind of two very different contexts and worlds. So we'll talk a little bit about how exciting that was when conducting an evaluation and thinking about the kinds of information that you want to gather. And when you're wearing a certain hat, what information is important to one organization or one group of stakeholders may be different to another group of stakeholders. Okay, so I am going to, this is where my technological skills, I'm going to stop sharing that and we're going to move back to our PowerPoint. Okay, so we're back here. Okay, so now we're going to launch kind of into walking through the evaluation process, from identifying stakeholders to the purpose, to the questions, the methods, and all of those pieces kind of across the process of evaluation. And we're going to keep that Tara Brentwood project in the back of our minds because we're going to use it throughout the day. But I really encourage you to bring your own examples and ideas forward based on your own experiences. So the first piece, when I had originally introduced those goals of community-based evaluation, so it's about engaging people, it's about learning together, and it's about sharing results for some kind of positive change. So the first piece that we're going to talk about is engaging people. So these might seem like three distinct phases, and I'm going to sort of present them in that way, Peter and I will, but of course, when we talk about engaging people, you don't just engage people at the beginning and kind of forget about them by the end. It's really about setting up how you engage people from the beginning and how you're going to continue to engage them over the course of the evaluation. And of course, people are going to have different levels of engagement. They're going to engage at different times for whatever makes sense in terms of their role as a stakeholder and their involvement. But it is really important to be thinking about how are you engaging those that have a stake in this evaluation, all the way from the very participants themselves to the folks that you want to be sharing or advocating around a particular program to as well. So that might be policymakers. So the first place we're going to start, though, is engaging people, and I'm using my wrong mouse here. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about stakeholders. I've been using that term a lot. I'm sure many of you are familiar with stakeholders. You may use slightly different language than that. And as I mentioned, it's really important to think about this from the beginning. So I know many of you have probably had different experiences where you get brought into an evaluation partway through, or sometimes at the very end. So we've been offering this program, we've been collecting a bunch of data, now can you please come and evaluate it? And of course that can be done. It's more challenging. I love it when people come, like Tara Brentwood, at the very beginning and say, Rebecca, we've got a model. Let's sit down and let's evaluate this together. Because from the very beginning, you can have all the kinds of conversations you need to, and you can set it up right from the get-go. So there's lots of different ways to think about stakeholders, and I'm going to present one way. I'm sure you have other ways that you think about, generate your list of stakeholders or map your stakeholders. But one way is to build a stakeholder map. I find this quite useful in my experience. So this is one example. So you can look at the concentric circles and you can think about stakeholders in sort of three main areas. You can think about those with lived experience. So those who have direct experience living with the issue. So in this particular case, it would be teen families. The next kind of circle out would be the influencers. So the people who impact the lives of those who live with the issue. So that may be the folks that are offering programming. It could be, you know, organizations that are supporting the staff. It could even be the community-based organizations that surround that supportive housing model. So the different community in which the housing would be happening, but also some of those organizations like the Edmonton Public Library or different kind of parenting programs kind of in the area. And then in the most outer circle would be the sustainers. So the people who have the power and resources to make lasting change to improve the lives of those that are involved in the project. So that could be everything from your kind of key decision makers within the evaluation to external bodies. So if it is a particular policy around housing, let's say that the sustainers are policymakers, and we need to figure out how are we going to share the evaluation information with those folks so that they can think about the policies that maybe create opportunities for housing for teen families, or actually make those opportunities really challenging. So in this particular case, these are 3 neat little circles. People don't always sit neatly in circles, we know that. So you can actually be sitting kind of across multiple layers. So you may be a sustainer, you may be a funder of the program. So you actually have the funds to sustain the program, but you're also an influencer because you're deeply involved. Like when I think of the Brentwood Housing, they're actually offering housing. They are thinking about the different families that they bring into that supportive housing model, and they're kind of deeply engaged in the process. So they can sort of hover over many, many different pieces. Are other people familiar with other ways of thinking about stakeholders that they want to share? Other kinds of mapping exercises that you've come across? So this is just one way thinking about sort of those 3 main areas of stakeholders, but do other people have other experiences with that? Silence. So nothing in the chat.
How many, I'm curious if you don't have perhaps a particular methodology that you've used to map stakeholders. I'm wondering how many of you in the course of the work that you do actually mapped your stakeholders, whatever method that is, even if it just means putting names on sticky notes and moving them around. Is that something that you've done in the course of your work? Okay, we do have some answers coming in. Some people have done that in the course of doing government consultations, where you often map out different stakeholders. And we also have another example that's appeared in the chatbot of asset-based mapping research or approach. So those are definitely examples of mapping stakeholders and participants. And other people have said they haven't done it yet, but you know what's fantastic is you're going to get a chance today to have get some practice with trying it out. Sorry, I'm hearing somebody online. If you want to try that again, we just had mixed audio happening.
I think it might have been somebody chatting with somebody else.
Okay. And it sounds like Big Brothers Big Sisters has done a fair amount of that stakeholder participant mapping stuff as well.
Kenda, we recently did that together. There's also different ways of thinking. So it could be asset-based, thinking about the levels. So I like this idea of producers, consumers. So it could be, who are the producers of information? Who might be the consumers of that information? So also thinking about on levels of influence. So, you know, whether they are influencing the evaluation in a particular way, are they internal to it? Are they external to it? Who might you want to share? So when you get to that end piece of sharing, or maybe you're sharing actually partway through any information, who are the folks that you want to be sharing it with, both internally and externally, so that you're getting the kind of feedback you need, so that we're getting actually some shifts and changes happening too. So thinking about stakeholders as broadly as possible. So anybody who could have a stake, and I find one of the easiest ways, if we could, is whiteboarding it. Physically together, you can just jot down all kinds of names, but then you can start to really think about, you know, how might we be engaging these people, and you can start to sort of put them into different spaces. So it could be in the circles, because you want to also think about what kind of information do they need? Are we gathering information from them, those with lived experience? or are we sharing information back with others, right? Because that's really important too, is thinking about the stakeholders that need to be involved in the evaluation itself, but also in doing something with the evaluation results. So oftentimes I find that we conduct evaluations, but we don't necessarily have some of the decision makers around the table and sort of have that vested involvement in the evaluation to be able to do something about it, to really understand what's going on. So that's where we often find, you know, you present back to the board, or you present back to kind of the decision makers within your organization, but perhaps there isn't that kind of engagement where movement is happening, where shifts in programs are happening. So what I'd like us to do in a few minutes is we're going to think about stakeholders, but before we get to that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about, within a community-based approach, often we like to build what we call a steering committee. I've called these different things, like a community-based evaluation team, a community-based committee, but essentially it's sort of thinking about all the stakeholders and getting enough folks around a table as you're preparing for, planning, implementing, and then also considering the results of the evaluation. It's that you need to have the right kind of folks around the table, that if you're, you know, taking a lead on the evaluation, or if you're doing this within your organization, that you've kind of got those checks and balances. So you can ask different folks within your steering committee, does this make sense? Should we be gathering information in this way? So if I was coming in externally into an organization and I said, well, I've always used surveys, this is what I'm going to use, and it's going to be online. Well, it may not be appropriate for the particular participants. There might be literacy issues. It might not be the resources and capacity the organization has actually to gather and then even to make sense of the data. So it's really nice to create a steering committee, you can call it whatever you want, an advisory committee around the evaluation. So the stakeholder map will help support this function. So it kind of informs who you might want to include. So as you map that out, you'd say, if we wanted to have the best people around the table to help us plan this, to implement it, and to make sense of the data, who might those people be? They can guide that evaluation through every step. They would meet regularly throughout the evaluation. So there is a commitment there, but part of that commitment is getting people really embedded and engaged and actually, you know, caring about the evaluation that's taking place. And then it also makes sure that hopefully the results are used. So making sure you have some decision makers around that table, the folks that can really take that information and do something with it. They're in a position to make decisions. And so why might we engage stakeholders? Because it can be very challenging. It can be time consuming, right? If we're trying to set up meetings, if we're trying to engage people from very different contexts, if they're coming from different positions, positionality, because it can be really challenging to host productive meetings when you've got, you know, one organization that's saying, I need this kind of information to be able to share with my funders or my board. And then you've got another group saying, but we really need this kind of information. That's what's useful to us as we reflect on our practice, right? So that can take time. But what's really nice is it brings a variety of valuable and of course, different perspectives. And different perspectives are really important because it sort of, you know, checks you don't have the blinders on. It'll open up some of those blind spots. It can add credibility to the evaluation, and they may have resources to help. So often I find not everybody has to participate equally across an evaluation, but there can be some times when people chip in and say, oh, we have somebody in-house that can do that, or here's something we've used in the past, or we have a little bit of resources or funding. They may be able to kind of network for you when it comes to sharing results, so they can create situations. In the case of Tara Brentwood, we had some really nice relationships with the city, and they ended up hosting an event for us where we were able to share some of the results from the particular evaluation. So it kind of amplified it to a different level. And then also engaging stakeholders can be really helpful, that everybody gets the opportunity to learn more about the evaluation and also about the program. and also build trust and understanding among many of the constituents that are involved in the process. Okay, so I am going to stop talking here for a little bit. We're going to engage in a little activity, and I'm concerned now because I know some people had challenges getting access. So I'm thinking, Andy, if you put that another Google shared.
It might be better now. It sounded like Chelsea had changed the permissions, so maybe people
Oh
won't
yeah?
have it.
Okay, so let's try that again. So what we're going to do is, I'm actually not me, Andy is going to share a link to a Google Doc. And we're going to take a look at it. And this is essentially another way of thinking about stakeholders. So there's different sort of categories of stakeholders. So I want you to take a look, and we've just listed out a bunch of potential stakeholders across these various kind of roles or areas. And so we'd like you to review that handout and then discuss the 5 types of stakeholders. So thinking about if you were going to include these stakeholders, would you include them all? Why or why not? Are there certain people that perhaps might be listing or that are missing from the list based on what you now understand to be the context of the supportive housing model? Are there individuals, organizations that haven't been considered that might also need to make it onto the list? And so what we're going to do is we're going to break you out into small groups, and we will, Peter, Kirsty, and myself will come join you. I don't know if Rochelle is still on. If she is, she'll probably join a group too. But I just want to make sure everybody can access that doc before we break away. So maybe just give me a thumbs up if you're able to. Got lots of thumbs up. Is everybody seeing the stakeholder map? Because I just clicked on it myself. But maybe I'm still sharing the PowerPoint. Peter, what do you see? Oh, Susan's not able to access it.
Sorry, you're still sharing your PowerPoint there, Rebecca.
Okay, because I just opened up.
Yeah.
Susan, can you try that PDF and see if that works for you? I'm thinking too, if we break out into groups, we can just share, or somebody can share their screen that has that stakeholder map, or sorry, the stakeholder list. So what I'm going to get Andy to do is break us off into smaller groups. And I think, how many do we have here? Is there 15-ish of us? So we could maybe do 3 groups of 5. And then we'll come and join you. But essentially, I just want you to look at that list and discuss as a group. You know, would you include all of these stakeholders? Why not? Are there particular people that might be missing? If you were to use the stakeholder map that I shared about those with lived experience, influencers, sustainers, where might you situate some of these people? And so we're gonna break off here right away, and we've got about 10 minutes for this activity. So I had a lovely discussion in my group, and I'm just curious what that experience was like for you. Was there a spot that your group got stuck thinking about the stakeholders? Was there any places where you couldn't agree on who to include, who to exclude? You wanted to include everybody. Is there anybody that wants to share, or from your group perspective? and not all at once.
Let's see if I'm just going to check and see if there's any action happening in the chat box here, but.
We had a bit of a different conversation mostly about like what, like who we thought might have been missing from the list. And then also just a bit of clarification of like why, like what roles some of the people on the list had. And then Crystal had a really great description of how a different way of thinking about the mapping would work. I don't know if Crystal wants to share. I really appreciated it, but it was a great description of like how to approach looking at the list and how to approach looking at how you might build a map out from that list.
Yeah, I think we had an insight that a list is not a map.
Yes.
So we weren't looking at a map, we were looking at a list, and then Crystal jumped in and gave some great examples of a way to organize that thing. Crystal, do you want to give us a taste of it?
No problem. And so the way that my mind works and the way that I look at evaluation is I start with a participant first, or the community member first, and who is most influential in their world and who is most influential to help build their capacity through this programming. And so from there, I start with a participant, and then that might be their families, their peers, their support network. And it also helps to align priorities or understand priorities of these stakeholders, and who also might have more influence, or who we might be more inclined to meet their priorities if they are at, or if they are more influential for our participants. So from there, then I would sort of map out or span out to program interventionists or program managers, or those who are interacting and delivering the program to the participants. From there, map out again towards community. And so it's sort of like a hierarchy or a mapping of influence, but also you can, through each of those concentric layers, you can identify the priorities at each level, and to be able to identify their communication needs as well in each of those layers.
That's super helpful, Crystal, because, you know, stakeholder, you can generate a list, but then you need some way of organizing that list, right? And making sense of it. And I liked your comment about kind of level of influence, but also what are, you know, there was a comment in the chat earlier, the producer and the consumer. So also what are they potentially contributing and producing as it relates to the evaluation, but also what are their needs? You mentioned communication, right? So thinking about even, you could map out when do you engage these people, for what purposes, and what kinds of information might they need in order to engage in the kind of stakeholder role that they need to engage in. So I'm just going to share with you, this was how we mapped the supportive housing. So we took kind of a simple approach to the idea of who were our internal stakeholders, who were our external stakeholders. We wanted to identify very specifically who our funders were, because often funders, we may be doing an evaluation of the program itself, but the funders themselves have other evaluative information that they're looking for from funding requirements. And then we had an evaluation team. So you'll notice that kind of, and each of them has their own circle. And actually in our group, we talked about, we actually need to separate out teen families, children, and the teens themselves, because there may be different needs that each of them have, or different kind of information we're gathering and also sharing back about, you know, child development versus teen parent development in this process. And you'll notice too that, you know, even within this circle, we've got funders kind of sitting within that internal role, and we've got funders sitting in the outside kind of circle too. But that, you know, if you think of an ecological map, that there is these levels of influence, right? So I like that idea, Crystal, of always thinking about the participant in the center, in the core, right? And mapping out what are the systems around them that are influencing, and then what are the systems outside of that, because you actually do need to think about all of the systems and things that are interacting in order to make sense of how you might actually engage people in what ways, and so that you're also really savvy to what might be happening, and you're not sort of thrown a a curveball partway through. Oh, we didn't even think about that particular stakeholder or partner. Where did they come from, right? And to be okay with that, that these processes are never finalized. So anything that we'll talk about today, a stakeholder map, you're going to add new stakeholders. Actually, people will present themselves and you'll add them over the course of an evaluation. And as you start to think about communication, you might engage other people. When Peter's gonna move us through kind of purpose, evaluation questions, and logic modeling, again, these things should always kind of be in draft form because you want to be willing to learn as you go and make some adaptations and changes.
So one way of looking at evaluations and in the whole nature of purpose of evaluations is, and I'm sure many of you have been exposed to this already, is there's three major ways that we talk about evaluation purposes. And we talk about them in terms of summative purposes, formative purposes, and developmental purposes. So in many instances, evaluations have what we would call a summative purpose, which is often an accountability function. So programs, for example, that come at the end of their funding cycles, quite often one of the expectations of funders is an evaluation to determine the success of the program and to determine what worked well and what didn't. So many of you have been exposed in one way or another in your work to what we would call summative evaluations. Another type of evaluation is more formative in nature, and that's the purpose is attached to actually improving a program that's ongoing. So in this instance, it could be that you've been running a program for a number of years, and now you're at a stage where you want to determine what's working and what's not working. And perhaps you're even interested in figuring out whether you want to scale up your endeavor or attempt to run a program in a different community. So formative evaluations are often, one of the purposes in that case is to understand what's working well with something that you're currently doing. Another type of purpose is developmental, and that's more in line with what Rebecca has shared with you. A developmental evaluation quite often happens in the context of complexity and in an environment where you're trying to figure out actually what might work and what might not work. So you're not even at the stage yet of knowing what your model is, but the purpose of the evaluation is to gain that clarity in terms of what approaches or methods might be useful considering, and using those insights to ultimately develop a pilot or a project. So as I've stated already, I mean, one of the key challenges early on, I think, in working with stakeholders is to figure out what is it that we're actually trying to learn through the evaluation, and how can we state that purpose in a clear statement that helps us understand what we're doing and prevents us from sort of running off madly in all directions. And so the purpose statement can cover different spaces, but a purpose statement can, in some cases, deal with process. So you might be interested in developing a purpose statement that describes where you might be assessing how well are we working together, how well have we implemented a change. We might have an evaluation purpose statement that's more anchored around outcomes or impacts, where you might be more interested in figuring out what's the difference that we're making. Or you might have a purpose statement that's interested in positioning in exploring the future. So it might be a purpose statement that's more anchored towards executing a series of evaluated functions in order to figure out what you want to do in the future. And so what you can see here is a very basic formula for writing an evaluation purpose. And so what it's saying here is that the purpose of the evaluation is to, and typically that's a verb, like evaluate, assess, towards a particular target or a process that you're trying to figure out in order to do something. And so an example of a purpose statement might be, and this is one that comes directly out of Brentwood. Here's the purpose statement that was formed in their work, as you can see here. So in the sense, so the Brentwood Terrorwood example, the purpose was to build and refine a model of supportive housing for teen families and explore the impact on the children. Okay, so a pretty precise purpose statement. It describes what the activities are to build and refine. it describes the target population or a target audience. It's a model for teen families, and it also, so it has some process outcomes, and it also has some outcomes in terms of results. So is this model working for children? So does anybody have any questions about why we would need to have a clear purpose statement? If you do, please throw it into the chat box. Okay, I think it seems pretty clear. Okay, so it's quite likely that you can have more than one purpose for an evaluation, but the work of trying to figure out, gain clarity on that purpose, I think, is fundamental, because it sets you up for actually identifying the type of questions that you want to explore. So typically out of that purpose statement will flow a set of natural questions that you're interested in exploring. And they could be a variety of questions, okay? So working with the steering committee, for example, you could brainstorm a number of questions that are attached to your purpose that you're interested in exploring. And it's likely that maybe you would generate more questions that's even possible to do within the scope of your evaluation. So one of your tasks when you're working with the steering team is to try to narrow that list of evaluation questions down to 3 or 4 key ones that you want to explore. And here's a couple of examples of the type of questions that you might be interested in exploring. You might be interested in knowing to what extent the program was implemented as was designed. You might be interested in knowing, has our program actually made a difference in the quality of life of participants? We might be interested in knowing whether it's increased their knowledge or their skills. You might be interested in knowing whether there's a chance to scale up your intervention or try it or use it in other contexts. You might even be interested in knowing whether the resources that you invested in your project were well spent. So that's a variety of questions. Now, even as you see here, there's basically 5 questions here. They're pretty big questions, and it's important then to even narrow that down further. So your aim is to come up with maybe 3 to 5 key questions that you want to build your evaluation around. And that, I think, is part of the reason it's so important that we have good connections with our stakeholders, because they will help to build out those questions and they'll help to focus the evaluation. So once you've built out your questions, another key step in the process of evaluation is to actually figure out your theory of change. Now, a theory of change is really a set of sort of assumptions or explanations as to what you think is necessary to achieve the desired change. Okay, so in the case of the Tara Brentwood example, there were specific outcomes that were desirable, such as healthy childhood development. There were specific outcomes for families. The theory of change is a way of trying to explain what are the conditions that are necessary for a particular impact to occur. And quite often, theories of change, the ones that I'm most interested in, are ones that sit at a higher level, and they describe what are the conditions that are necessary for a particular change to occur. So for example, if we used the example of healthy child development, we can by sort of doing some background research and through our own experience, come up with what we think are sort of the key factors that are necessary for healthy child development. And that starts to lay out a framework for you to think about which of those factors do we have influence over, and what types of activities might we engage in to achieve that precondition that can lead to a beneficial outcome. So one way that I, in my mind, try to separate out theories of changes from logic models is, most of us have been exposed to probably the most basic theory of change that you encounter in your everyday organizational life, which is a strategic plan. A strategic plan really is a theory of change. It says, here we are today, here's where we want to be, And here's the 3 or 4 or 5 goals that we're going to invest in as an or that we're going to pursue as an organization in order to achieve that preferred future state. So strategic plans tend to be at a much higher level, and they tend to describe where you're going to place your strategic investments, but they don't necessarily describe the activities. And so I often see a strategic plan being similar to a theory of change, and a logic model being similar to an operational plan, where a logic model visualizes your theory of change and describes things in more detail. So here's what most of you have probably encountered in your life, is a logic model that's similar to this, which is kind of a roadmap, a description of where you're going to put your resources, what activities you're going to generate in your program, what those activities lead to in terms of outputs, and then how those outputs align to outcomes. So a logic model very much is this kind of explanation of how change happens. And it's a framework that helps you think about why you do what you do. Now, the interesting thing about logic models is I think we often do them within the course of our programs and then they sit on a shelf somewhere. But logic models are really, their real value is in helping us articulate our key assumptions around how change happens. And most effective logic models need to be living documents, because as we engage in trying to run programs, we often, in running our programs, we often discover whether our assumptions bear fruit or not. And so good logic models tend to also need to be adapted over time to take into account new learnings. The other thing that I think is worth considering when we talk about logic models is our programs always operate within a much larger context, and there are often external factors that have a great deal of influence over our ability to achieve our ultimate outcomes. And so as we develop our logic models, I think it's important that we do so with some humility, because there are, in many cases, larger external factors that have influence over what we're trying to achieve. And if we look at our scope of influence, quite often, as programs, we have the most influence up to the outputs in our short-term outcomes. But as we look at longer-term outcomes, our direct influence tends to be less. So a logic model is useful in identifying those connections, and it's useful for helping us think about our work. So let me share with you a very simple sort of logic model that was developed during a course that I think Rebecca ran out in Claremont University a few years ago. And this logic model is really built around the basic question of how do we ensure that participants in a workshop are not hungry. So in this situation, the question that we're faced with is that we have a bunch of folks online that are hungry, and we need to solve that problem. So here's the long-term outcome. Participants are no longer hungry. So we are going to solve that problem. We have a bunch of inputs at our disposal that can help us address the issue of participants being hungry. One is we've got people. So we've got people on hand that can help us. We've got some funds, which we might be able to buy lunch for people. And we have some technology at our disposal that we could use to try to solve this riddle of making sure people are fed. So we've got software, we've got Google, etc. Our activities are we're going to actually use the people at our disposal and our funds to identify what where the local restaurants are, develop a map for people so they know where the restaurants are, and then we're going to distribute those maps to our participants. Now, what we're hoping will come out of these activities is that we're going to generate a concrete output, which is a map. Okay. And we're also going to generate another output, which is that participants actually have the map in their hands. And so our assumption is if we have the map and we give the map to our participants, this will lead to a change in their knowledge, which means they now know what options are available. And they also know where to go if they want to go and eat, which ultimately leads to participants selecting and going to a restaurant, and achieves the long-term purpose of our people no longer being hungry. So this is a very simple logic model, and I think one thing that's interesting is this logic model, if we talk about context, this logic model might not even work anymore because of COVID. COVID might have actually eliminated some of these, our assumptions, and we might have to develop a new logic model because we might not be actually able to physically go to restaurants. Okay, so moving on, and we're now at the end, I just want to share with you very quickly what one logic model looks like that Tara Brentwood developed. And you can see here, for example, that Tara developed a logic model that includes inputs. It includes a series of activities that are tied to the wraparound supports that are provided to families. And then it includes a series of key sort of outcomes and changes that were identified as happening within the short, medium, and long term, with the ultimate goal being that children are healthy and successful young adults. Now, to test this logic model, each of these outcomes, ultimately you'd be asking yourself, what's the evidence that we're achieving some of these outcomes? And how do we, for example, know that safety, for example, parents feeling safe will help lead to better social outcomes for children? So the great thing about logic models is they not only do you have an opportunity to test your logic models with evidence, but you can also use the logic models to look even into the literature and see what do we know about some of these outcomes. Okay, so Rebecca, do you want to share just this very quickly with folks and give them a sense of where this came out with? Because it sounded like within your work with Tara Brentwood that there were two kind of almost logic models that you developed, each with a different audience in mind.
Sure. Yeah. So as I mentioned much earlier in the presentation today, that we had two big partners. So Tara Center, that has a certain orientation in the way that they engage with teen families, and Brentwood Housing, that has a certain orientation and they provide housing, and also just different perspectives. So when we started engaging in this logic model process, we had built out a logic model, got lots of input, and so the one that Peter just showed, and it wasn't totally connecting and resonating, especially with our Tara staff. So we decided to, and actually it was a colleague of mine, Jaden Springett, and we engaged in a process with them where we essentially rolled out a massive piece of butcher block paper, and we drew out kind of the trunk of a tree, and we had sticky notes, and we had stickies that were in the form of leaves. We had stickies in the form of like buds, apples. And so we just started having a conversation in a very kind of metaphorical way of building out a logic model. So if we say that, okay, in order for a tree to grow and develop, or a plant, we need to have some really good kind of inputs and activities going on. So those are the roots. So we just got them to sort of list out what are all of the kind of things that are going to support the health and development of this tree or of the children in this program. Then we got people to kind of use those stickies, and we said, okay, in the short term, for apples, to build that apple pie, which was our ultimate outcome, and the impact was that we had healthy young children and families, we need first to have some initial short-term outcomes. So we called those the buds on the tree, right? So an apple tree blooms. In order to get apples, we have to have buds. So we got them just to kind of sticky note that and put it on the tree. And then we said, okay, buds turn into apples. So that's kind of, you have to start here. And then, well, in a short period of time, we've got buds. We had a much longer period of time, into 12 months and plus. But in the medium term, what were some of the things that we could expect? In the short term, if this happens, then what would be the next logical place for teen families to go? And then ultimately that long-term outcome. So we actually built a visual description, and this, just engaging in that process of drawing the tree, writing on the stickies, and building that metaphor, was like, it totally resonated. We were able to sort of build out the logic model, and all of the staff that were involved in the program, it made sense to them. We still needed that sort of boxes and connecting and making sure we had the more traditional kind of linear approach, because that's what Brentwood really wanted to see, and they wanted to be able to map it that way. And if you look, I mean, if you Google online, there's lots of different kinds of logic models that you might see. People will build out circular logic models. But I find sometimes if you're having a hard time kind of filling boxes, that sometimes you can take an arts-based approach, and that seemed to really resonate with this group. If you're working with youth, sometimes that's a really good approach as well.
Good. Thank you. So the logic model in one way is a way of holding, is a way of visualizing a theory of change, capturing your core assumptions, and making explicit why we think certain activities will lead to certain changes. So that I think the value in a logic model is that it creates a space for those types of conversations to happen. Oftentimes in our programs, there's lots of implicit logic that's built into our programs. Reasons we do things that we might not fully explain to others. And so the process of developing a logic model or developing a visualization of your change process is very important for surfacing those assumptions and testing those assumptions. So a good logic model or a good theory of change should be something that you could test your assumptions. You should be able to run backwards and forwards within that process, continually asking yourself why. Why will this make a difference? How will we know this makes a difference? Those types of questions, I think, are essential for any change effort. So just in terms of a few last sort of tips on logic models, it's important not to get overemphasize the activities in your logic models. A logic model should explain change. It shouldn't just be a description of what you're currently doing. I think quite often one of the challenges we have in developing logic models is that they become mirrors of what we're currently doing versus descriptions of how change happens. Another pitfall that we fall into when we deal with logic models is we think we have it all figured out. So I think it's very important that we maintain humility and open-mindedness towards our logic models. And I think another trap is feeling that we have to continually develop the logic model, okay? It's very much a shorthand. So at some point we do have to decide this is good enough, and now let's get on with the data gathering components. So we don't want to get stuck perpetually in a logic model cycle forever either. So with that, I think I'm going to pass it over to Rebecca. Give up control of the PowerPoint.
Actually, Peter, keep your PowerPoint going. I think it's probably easier.
Okay.
It'll save me. I'll just tell you when to click forward.
Sure, that works
okay.
perfectly.
Awesome.
Okay.
So you'll notice Peter and I are getting into rapid mode because we've got about 55 minutes, and we do want to leave some space at the end to share some kind of future opportunities, and also some space for you to sort of share with us your experiences today. So as I mentioned earlier today, there are those 3 goals of community-based evaluation, but that we can't think of them as kind of concrete. You're done one goal, move on to the next, even though it's set up that way. But that ultimately, like, we're now into this learning together piece, which is really about gathering information in some kind of systematic way so that we can make sense of data and use it. But we've been learning together all throughout this process. And if you are engaging stakeholders, if you are engaging a steering committee or some kind of a working group around this, ultimately it is a co-creation and a co-learning process across the course. So we'll go to the next slide, Peter. So what I'd like to talk a little bit more about now is data gathering. I'll go back one, yeah. And before we can talk about data gathering, and in fact, we could have been talking about ethics from the very beginning of this, we really do need to always be thinking about ethics within evaluation. So of course, I'm part of an academic institution, so we always need to be thinking about ethics. Does this project require ethics? We have an ethics board at the university. There are also community-based ethics boards. There's one here in Alberta. You can have a project reviewed out of the Center for Community-Based Research as well if you want to know what are some of the ethical implications of the evaluation I'm involved in or the research that I'm getting involved in. But ultimately, there's 2 big things that we need to think about is do no harm. So both on an individual, but also on a community level. We need to think about informed consent, whether that's formal, where people are filling out you know, an informed consent process to say, I understand what I'm getting involved in, I understand the purpose of the evaluation, what kind of information you're going to be collecting from me, and how you're going to use that information. And people need to be informed about their decision and in terms of agreeing to participate. And we also need to think about who are the stakeholders we're involving, who are we gathering information from within the evaluation, and also who are we going to share that information with. So in the case of Tara Brentwood, we are dealing with vulnerable youth. And these youth are parents themselves, but they're also, some of them, under the age of 18. So we need to make sure that we're protecting those children, or the youth themselves, but also the children that they represent, because we're gathering data on their children. We're also gathering data on these parents, and parents are providing information about their relationships with kids, their experiences within a program. So it's really important to think about the vulnerability, the needs of the stakeholders that you're engaging, and really being aware, keenly aware of who's going to be gathering this information. So are you gathering it within the organization? Are you hiring an external person that's going to be gathering this information? How are they going to maintain confidentiality, anonymity of that information? Who might have access to it? And ultimately, who are you going to share it with in the end? And making sure you're sort of being keenly aware of that as you go along. And I think a really important piece, and I think it was a comment way back in the chat function, is being really careful about how much information you collect. So often, you know, Peter was talking about, we've got all these evaluation questions, and there may be lots of different information that we can gather, but really being purposeful about what you collect that you're actually going to use. So I think often we get caught in the trap of, well, we'll just add those extra few questions, or we'll just make sure we gather the same information just in case we need it. And so thinking about the burden of the participants that you're engaging, right? Because you want to get really good, meaningful information that can be used to inform practices, programs, and policies. And also thinking too about the power dynamic. So if I come in as an external evaluator, asking for information, whether it's from staff or from participants, that sets up a dynamic. And also people may not feel comfortable, especially teen families, where they're trying to get safe, secure, supportive housing. If I say anything negative about this program, am I going to be kicked out of the program? Right? So being very clear about the nature of how people can participate and how the information is going to be used, because oftentimes people don't know. They're very concerned about, if I say anything bad or if I give any kind of feedback, I might lose my I might lose the opportunity to have this particular service. And of course, ethics is one of those things where, you know, like much of this presentation, we don't just think about ethics at a point in time, like engagement. We should be thinking about it all along. And we should be thinking about it as we generate, what is the purpose of our evaluation? What kinds of questions should we be asking? Who should we be engaging? How are we going to gather the information? There's ethical considerations across all of that. So we'll just go to the next. Actually, I'm going to skip to the next.
Okay.
The next one. Okay, so I'd like to talk about different methods for collecting information, or back one, Peter, sorry. Different methods for collecting information. And I'm sure you all have experience either participating in different evaluations, filling out questionnaires, or maybe somebody interviewed you, and or soliciting information. I'm just curious if people want to share in the chat some of the different methods that you have used in the past, or methods that you've kind of participated in before. And if you just want to take that in. So we've got some direct calls for feedback. So calling up participants, doing surveys and questionnaires for current monthly surveys. So lots of surveys. Does anybody use kind of, well, the calling, I guess, asking questions, or maybe it's an intake form. You can use intake information when clients come in. one of the first questions I always ask whenever a group comes to me and wants to do an evaluation is I say, what information are you already collecting? Because oftentimes people are actually gathering quite a bit of information. They may not even know that it's usable data. And so it's always important to find out, what are you collecting already? What do you have in your existing databases? And how might that data help to answer the kinds of questions that we need to answer? And I just want to clarify, when Peter was talking about generating evaluation questions, those are not the questions that are on your survey, right? We've got overarching evaluation questions that'll answer the purpose of our evaluation, but ultimately the questions we engage in a survey, in a focus group, in an interview, those are the kinds of questions that are going to give us the evidence to answer the more broader evaluation question. So it is really important to always look at, what data do we already have and is available to us? And in that data, are there any gaps, right? So do we need to make some slight tweaks if there is an intake form, but there's some really good, you're getting really good demographic information, or you do kind of a post assessment once people engage in a particular, participate in a 3-week program, you're asking about knowledge and skills, and it might just be that that needs a little refinement or modification to ensure we're asking some additional questions. But it could also be that we need to look at other kinds of methods for gathering information, because a survey is not going to capture what we need, right? Because a survey will typically give us a fair bit of breadth on a topic, but it doesn't necessarily get at the depth, right? So we can get lots of trends if we want that from a larger group, but we can't necessarily understand people's experiences. We can, of course, have open-ended questions on surveys and questionnaires, but we don't necessarily get at that depth in terms of, you know, what was the experience for you? Describe that to me, which you might be able to get if you're kind of having a one-on-one conversation with somebody. So I see a few people have also indicated that they have used different arts-based activities, and we'll share a little bit about that. Dotmocracies, different ways of gathering information. And I think now that we're moving into an online space, we're getting really creative about how we can gather information in just a conversation, right? And that we ask purposeful questions, and that we gather information and document that information. So I've been talking a little bit about different kinds of methods. So there's sort of like 2 big camps, right? There's qualitative and quantitative, and you've probably heard those terms before. So under qualitative methods, we would see things like individual interviews, where I sit down with Peter and I've got kind of a series of questions, and I really invite him to share his experiences about a program or about a particular organization or an experience. Focus groups is when we get a larger group together. And what's really neat about focus groups is you find that people will actually start to build on what other people are saying. The same as in the chat box, right? You'll start to build on people's conversations. We've hosted community forums in the past, and that's kind of like a focus group on steroids, where you've got lots of people in a room and you're rapidly trying to get lots of feedback. You can do participant observations. You can even do a comprehensive kind of review of the literature or scoping review to find out what models exist, what kind of data already exists in the landscape that we could actually apply in this particular context. In terms of quantitative, many of you already mentioned surveys, questionnaires, there's census data. We can get large data sets, like health data, for example. We might be doing secondary data analysis on that to understand trends, and then to build out our own surveys or interview guides based on those trends. We can have intake forms. But some critical things are, we always need to consider who's going to be collecting this information and analyzing the data. And that's important from an ethical perspective. So is it a person that is in a position of power, where people may feel uncomfortable if they're the one collecting the information, or is it somebody external that also may not be a comfortable situation? But also, who's collecting the information? Do they have the capacity, right? So if we are asking, I do a fair number of assessments with children, well, you have to have special training for that. So we need to be really considerate about how we answer the questions, but do we have the capacity to use those measures or those tools in order to answer the questions? And ultimately, do we also have the capacity to analyze that information? So we can use surveys, but do we have the capacity to actually analyze the data? So, you know, there's simple programs, you can use Excel and that, but if you're looking at more comprehensive kind of analyses, then we need to make sure we have the capacity in-house. Because I think the worst thing to do is collect data that you don't have the capacity to analyze or use, because then that's not a good use of participants' time. So data can be primary data where we're collecting it, it's brand new, but it could also be secondary. So it could be that you've been gathering data, and I did this with government quite a while ago. There was a lot of secondary data that had already been collected over a long period of time. So it's mining that data to look at trends and then pulling out some of the trends to say, okay, I want to do a deeper dive in these particular topics. So that would be, now we're getting into primary, but we started with some secondary data. And always, I've started to trend this direction. I'm actually a quantitatively trained person, and realize that I can get lots of information from surveys and questionnaires, but I really wanted to understand more of the why, right? Why do people respond in this way? So I find people strongly agree that it was a good experience, but what about the experience? What were some of the elements of the experience? So then I wanted to ask questions about that. And actually that's where we start to use multiple methods and bringing those two together. So essentially, I'm sure you've heard the term multiple or mixed methods. And that's kind of the direction I think lots of evaluations are trending towards, that a survey or a quantitative is only going to tell you so much information, and you need to marry that up with some experiential stories, conversations with your participants. And actually that tells a really nice kind of integrated story about how a program is working. So we'll just go to the next slide, Peter. So when we think about gathering information, we want to make a plan in advance, right? So we're identifying what are the various measures that we're going to use, what are the various methods that we're going to use, and if we devise that plan, we need to sort of implement the plan. So we might realize though, which has happened to me, and particularly happened to me in the Tara Brentwood project, we worked really closely with the staff, we worked really closely with the organizations to identify the kinds of measures we were going to do. Assessments on the children, we had lots of questionnaires for parents to fill out, and actually we realized pretty early on, and we had the staff engaged and everything, and they had suggested this was the best way, and that's not how the teams wanted to engage. So they just were not showing up to fill out these questionnaires. That was not how they wanted to engage, and so we had to pivot really quickly. So we had a lovely plan, we mapped out the plan, and the plan actually wasn't working. So we had to pivot, and we had to think about how do these teens actually want to engage in sharing their experiences about the program. And that's where we actually pivoted to an arts-based approach. And I'll chat a little bit later about that. We used a photo voice approach, or I think maybe Peter, that's in the knowledge sharing. But when we're engaging in any kind of approach to methods of gathering information and using that, we really need to make sure people are trained adequately. So that becomes that capacity piece. And if you don't have the capacity in-house, you can partner up. So often organizations will partner up with us to collect some information, or they've collected it and they just need support in terms of analyzing qualitative focus group interview data or survey data. And I would encourage you to look to the university, and you can come visit us at CUP, because that's kind of what we do, is we link up. We want to connect graduate students that have some of this expertise. They're really interested in getting applied experiences and working in partnership with community. And they've got lots of really good, lots of good resources to tap into. And so, again, I've already mentioned that, making sure that you're considering ethics kind of across everything you do all the time, and be running that constantly through the steering committee. So that's where we had to pivot in the Tara Brentwood to an arts-based approach. We kept bringing that back to our committee to say, okay, why aren't teams engaging? What are you hearing? You've got your ear to the ground. What is it about this approach that it's not resonating with them? And so we just kept generating new ideas, right? And I think sometimes if you get entrenched in a particular way of doing something and you're not open to saying, okay, we need to pivot, right? It's the same thing. You send out a survey and you're like, I'm not getting the kind of response I expected, right? That you need to think about how either I need to engage people better, I need to send it out, different networks, maybe somebody else needs to send it out on my behalf, or we need to think about a different way of gathering this information. So maybe I'll just pause there and see if anybody has any questions about methods, a particular method you've been curious about, haven't used, or just anything in terms of what I've just been chatting about. A thumbs up, Miriam. Okay, so there's nothing in the chat. So I'll just share with you some of the methods that we used in the Tara Brantwood. So again, we were using a developmental approach to the evaluation. So really walking alongside this model as it was starting to shape up and really gathering information about aspects of the model at critical periods of time and sharing that back in through this committee so that we could be rapidly learning and modifying as we went. We learned so many things and had to make rapid adjustments. And I mean, one of them was in terms of the methods of how we were even gathering information. So we did use surveys. We had questionnaires about experience in the program, but we had direct assessments of children, and we wanted to understand child development over a period of time. So we were assessing the kids clinically at 3 different time points. And then we were asking parents to fill out questionnaires about what was their relationship with the kids, attachment, those types of things. So we had different measurement tools, standardized tools. We also had a database. So Tara uses something called efforts to outcomes. I know that many other organizations have databases where that's kind of your client intake, or if staff are seeing participants, it's, you know, how many visits, for how long, for what purpose. So we actually had a fair number of resources that we could tap into. And Peter, we'll just go to the next slide. So as I mentioned though, quantitative can give you sort of one piece of, and typically more of a broad capture of information. And so I like this, that not everything that counts can be counted and not everything that can be counted counts. So sometimes we need to do a deeper dive and really understand the experiences from the perspective of the participants or the staff as well, that we might not get in an anonymous kind of survey. So we'll go to the next slide. So we did actually a mixed methods approach. So we had quantitative and qualitative, and we were going to integrate that information to really make sense of how this program was unfolding, it was fairly complex, but also the kinds of adjustments that we had to make. So we did interviews with the staff, all the staff that were involved in the program, all the way up to the leadership. We had meetings, regular meetings with all the staff, and we actually had the staff journaling and doing kind of outcome mapping. So that was also, not only was it an opportunity to gather information, it was an opportunity to rapidly bring information back to the table to say, here's what we're hearing, here's what we're learning. What do you think of that? How do you make sense of that? What do we need to shift in terms of the program? So there was a lot of shifts and changes that happened even in terms of how teams entered the program, because they realized they needed a much more kind of rigorous vetting process for who might, because what they were finding is teens were getting evicted. So they weren't successful in the program, and it was the nature of the teen that was entering the program. So they realized that there needed to be a certain readiness of any teen family that entered the program. So it kind of gave them almost a 2-staged approach, but we wouldn't have learned that unless we sort of paid attention to certain things and talked to staff often. And as I mentioned, teens would fill out the questionnaires, but not to the level of engagement that we expected. So we tried an approach, photo voice, and I don't know, I mean, some people have mentioned arts-based activities. I know Peter's got lots of experience with photo voice. But this was one approach that we used with the teens. And essentially what it is it's an opportunity for individuals or members to take photos in response to a question, right? So the question that we asked the teen families was, what does it mean to raise healthy young children? or what does it mean to raise your child in this program? So essentially the teens would go out, they would take images, and then we would come back as a group. We always shared a meal together. What was really unique about Tara Brentwood is that where the housing was, there was actually a house across the street that the staff could use. And so, you know, the teens would come there, we'd share a meal, they'd bring their kids, there was childcare, and then we would just have a discussion about, oh, you took these photos, tell me about those photos, right? And so what you end up doing is eliciting kind of qualitative information, and you can attach those descriptions to the photos. And so that was quite powerful. The teens showed up every single, we did this, I think we met every week or every 2 weeks, and they showed up consistently, and we had amazing participation. This was how they wanted to engage. So not only, oops, sorry, Peter.
One thing to note, I just want to jump in. The power, I think, of some of these arts-based approaches is that they are by themselves an intervention of a kind. So oftentimes what happens is that by using these approaches, people actually gain confidence. They gain a sense of having a voice. And so the way of gathering perspectives is itself an empowering activity, which I think makes it distinct from other methods like surveys, which are a little bit more passive in their orientation.
Yeah, and what it created too was a community among the teen parents themselves. So while they were all living in the same housing complex, they weren't necessarily next door neighbors, right? So it was an opportunity for those teens to come together and almost have their own community of practice. And they were also able to, you know, talk about the program and kind of share information with us as the researchers that we could sort of bring back to the staff to say, you know, here are some of the experiences, but it was fairly anonymous, that these teens didn't have to approach the staff member and say, I'm not, you know, I don't like this aspect of the program. So it was a mechanism too to share feedback because we met quite regularly. So we'll just go to the next slide, Peter. So I'm not going to get too much into analysis, because analysis, it's similar to methods, right? Like we just sort of gave you the overarching, there's quant, there's qual, there's surveys, but when you get into questionnaire development, survey development, I mean, you need to be very careful about what are the kinds of, similar to building your evaluation questions, you don't want to just throw the laundry, what is it? The sink, in the kitchen sink. You don't want every single question in there just because. You need to be really thoughtful about what are you asking and why? And then what's the best way to ask that kind of a question? Is it open-ended? Is it on a Likert scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree? Or if it's about knowledge, very little to quite a bit. And you need to be able to think about, how am I going to analyze this information? And in how I analyze that, who do I involve in that analysis process, right? Because sometimes making, or sense making in terms of evidence, is actually engaging that steering committee again. So they may not be sitting at the computer crunching numbers, but they really need to sort of sit with you and think about the data that has been analyzed and interpret that, right? So that's where you might want to bring the participants themselves, and that's where photo voice is very powerful, because you say, here's how I'm making sense of the information. Does that resonate with you, right? So you're kind of co-creating it together. But you do need to think very carefully about, I've gathered all this information. Do I have the capacity to be able to analyze it? Do I have the skills, the resources in-house? Do I need to engage some external people to support me in this process? And then as I'm engaging in analysis, now we need to start thinking about, how are we going to share those results and the information that come out of the analysis. So I'll just pause there and see if anybody has any questions. I see that people are having to sign off, and then I'm going to hand it back over to Peter.
So I think we're on the home stretch. Is there any comments or questions about this whole, so what we've talked about so far is the whole process of engaging community, the importance of identifying a purpose for your evaluation. We've talked about developing some overarching evaluation questions that are at the core of your evaluation work. And now we've talked a little bit more about different tools and approaches for gathering evidence, and ultimately analyzing that evidence with the community to gain some insights. But is there anything else that sort of jumps out at people at this stage before we move on to the last phase, which is really about sharing the learnings? If we're good to go, I'll just motor into that, and then we'll leave some space at the end for further comments from everybody. So we're at the sort of a key point in the journey of evaluation, especially as it relates to that question of use, okay? And as it relates to the question of what kind of commitments we make to community when we do community-based work. One of the commitments quite often that communities are very concerned about when we do community-based research is, will the information be used? How will it be shared back with the community and with various stakeholders? So one of the key challenges in evaluation work is to think about the various different ways in which you might share those results with communities. We've already talked earlier about stakeholders, and it's likely that different stakeholders have different needs in terms of their preferences for what form the information should be shared in and when it should be shared. And so, for example, if a funder is part of an evaluation, they might have a preference towards having the information shared at critical points in their funding cycle. And they might need that information presented in a particular way to help them understand whether they should continue funding the project or not. A community, on the other hand, might have different interests in terms of what kind of information they want shared and the way in which that information is shared with them. So part of the challenge of thinking about the dissemination of findings from an evaluation is to think very carefully about all the different audiences that have an interest in this work and how do we communicate with them. And that ties back into the ethics as well, because some of the considerations around how you're going to share ties directly into those ethical considerations, but it also ties into the type of commitments that you've negotiated with your community from the beginning of your research. It's hard to share certain types of information after the fact if you haven't gained permission earlier on to gather them. So here, for example, there's a range of different ways that and formats that evaluation learnings can be shared. On the left-hand side, you'll see what we're very familiar with, which is evaluation reports and articles and letters, in some cases, news releases. So we have in our culture a real a tendency to use the written word as a way of communicating results. Now that works for certain people, but it doesn't work for everybody. So it's important to look at other ways of communicating results as well. And increasingly now we're getting into a world where results are being shared more in the form of visuals, infographics, posters, videos, even comic books, for example, are powerful tools for sharing results for different audiences. And then there's other forms of sharing that are more performative in a sense. So another way in which results are often shared are through presentations or community gatherings, storytelling sessions. There's even theater and drama is a way that's being used by some groups to present findings. So the challenge is to develop as a steering group and as a collaborative is to figure out what are the different ways that we're going to communicate our findings to different audiences, and then developing a plan for mobilizing that knowledge. And sometimes, for example, Rebecca shared the photo voice. Photo voice is a powerful tool because it also produces visuals, and it's a powerful tool for storytelling. So for example, having a photo voice as part of your data gathering process also gives you artifacts that you can then share in other ways, whether that's online or whether it's an actual exhibit in City Hall. So it's useful to think as you're doing data gathering, how can we use this? How might we be able to present this data in interesting and compelling ways once we're at that point where we're ready to share our learnings.
Peter, did you want me to take this on, or were you just leaving space?
How does this, are you doing this magically by yourself?
No.
I guess it has had built into an audio.
Oh, I don't think the audio was working. I think it's because I pulled it from something else. But the last slide was just some nice examples of tools.
Oh,
you
sorry.
can use.
No, on my end, I was hearing audio, Rebecca.
Oh, yeah.
That's where I stopped.
Yeah, we didn't.
Oh, okay. So maybe go back. So what, I'm sorry about that. It's just it had Rebecca's voice in here magically appearing, and then I just let her go. So she was describing a variety of tools that are at our disposal these days that can help with knowledge dissemination. So we've got really convenient tools these days for doing infographics, and you can see Canva as one example. We've got powerful tools for developing podcasts, and radio shows and things like that are powerful ways of getting information out there. And then we're also finding these days that dashboards are very useful tools for visualizing information. And you can see here an example and so here's an example of a dashboard that was used with the city of Edmonton to share findings. I mean, and then there's other powerful tools, and I'm going to let Rebecca speak to this one, but this is an example of a student arts-based project that shared some student findings here too. So do you want to jump in there and just give us a little bit of a sense of that?
Sure.
as a
Yeah, so this was a project we were working in 4 First Nation communities, and it was really about kind of understanding healthy child development from a community perspective. And we were doing lots of interviews and focus groups to understand from the perspective of youth, adults, elders within the community about healthy development. And one elder shared a story about the health and development of a child in terms of the growth and development of a plant. So similar to how we did the logic model exercise, she described, starting with like deep foundations and roots, and what those roots represented in enriching soil, and what that enriching soil would be in terms of the things that would surround a child, creates a strong cultural identity, which is a strong stem, and then ultimately you've got this beautiful flower. And so we were going to share our information back, and typically when you share qualitative information, it's like the theme was strong identity, and you describe that. Well, one of the students that was working on the project, Garrett, he's the one holding the painting, he sort of had this idea, well, he's a painter, and he said, why don't I paint the metaphor that the elder came up with, and we can actually use that to showcase the data. So he actually painted this image, and then when we went to share the thematic codes from the qualitative information back, we ended up just kind of placing it on the image, and it totally resonated with people. It was a really kind of visual way of representing data versus just reading lots of quotes. So, and then we ended up reprinting these images and gifting them to the communities and to the schools that participated. So it was quite, it was just a much more visual and engaging way of sharing data. Are you getting my weird recording again?
I was, I was listening to 2 voices at the same time, your live voice and a recording on the PowerPoint here.
I want to make sure you're listening,
But anyways,
Peter.
it's also, yeah, no. But so it's also an example of empowerment, and the way in which even the process of mobilizing knowledge can be a community building exercise unto itself, and an empowering exercise. So other examples that I think are worth checking out are more video-based ways of disseminating. And on this screen, you can find a couple of examples of that. Obviously, these are more are more labor and resource intensive to do things like videos. Although it's getting easier these days with the ability for people to record small videos on their iPhones and even edit those videos within their computers. So the threshold for doing video is much less these days, but it is still a much more resource intensive process. But it can be a very powerful tool for communicating findings as well. And then there's the more interactive components, which are ways of sharing results. And here you see some examples of theater-based approaches for sharing the findings and insights from evaluation work. And that's, I think, also a very powerful approach to consider, because it also, the whole idea of using theater also creates it's a way of gathering community around something as well. And so it's another creative approach to knowledge mobilization. And then there's the last piece here, and I think this is where it cuts back into the question of visualization, but it's really figuring out how to take what can be fairly technical information and then presenting it back to communities in ways that are engaging visually and oftentimes in plain language. So here are two examples of community reports that were written with the intention of being highly accessible documents. And you could see here the very compelling way of using visuals to communicate risk factors for chronic disease. So I think we are actually living right now in the golden age of knowledge mobilization. I can't imagine another time in history where there are as many tools available to us and as many channels that we have today for sharing information. So some of it, I think, just comes down to being very intentional about the choices we make around how we share things, and thinking very carefully about the preferences of the different communities that we're trying to do outreach to. So that's my sharing piece. I'm going to put it onto the last page here, and you can see.
Peter, just before
Sure.
you switch, I just wanted to add something.
Certainly.
That, kind of going back to that original kind of starting place today, when we think about the stakeholders that we engage and then thinking about communication. So being really, again, going back to that steering committee and asking the question, we've got all this information, but what are the best ways to mobilize it, right? And if we're sharing back with participants, it might be a particular way. If we're sharing information with a broader community, it might be in a particular way, but really understanding what's the best way, and that there's not going to be a one size fits all, but you also have to be okay with the fact that you cannot produce, a photo voice exhibit and a video and all of these different things, but maybe what are some accessible ways that meet several of your stakeholders. But then if it is a policy group or advocacy, you might need to write a policy brief, and that's going to look slightly different. But just sort of understanding the communication needs of yours. So it's kind of like knowledge needs or how they're going to use that information. So also giving it to them in a format. And sometimes we've done that where we've just created a couple slides where if they want to present that information back to the board or back to their staff or the organization, they actually have the information themselves. So it's kind of tailoring the information so that it can actually be usable is really important. And these are just a few examples of different ways that we've done that in past projects.
And it's possible to anticipate some of these things early on, and not completely, because you always want to be receptive to what you discover as you do the work. But I've seen a useful tool sometimes is one that allows you to map out in advance uses and users, and it gets you to think about what are the various different questions that different stakeholders might have. What are their preferences for receiving that information? So in what form do they want that information received in what time frame do they want that information received in? And what are their opportunities for using this information? Because different organizations, for example, and different stakeholders have different needs. And so, for example, a policymaker might have a requirement to have something in a 3-page briefing that they are going to use to make a funding or a program decision, and maybe they need that at a particular window of time, whereas other stakeholders have different preferences and different timeframes that they're operating in. So these are all things that you can sort of figure out with your steering committee, so that you could make some very intentional and effective decisions around how you're going to share the results of your work together. So I'm going to move us to the next slide, which is just an invitation in a way for you to check out a few other resources that are attached to the Evaluation Capacity Network. So we've got a couple of part of what we're attempting to do, and one of our big mandates is to provide, to help build the capability of organizations and individuals to do this type of work. So we have at our disposal a lot of resources to support coaching and mentoring. We've been running a couple of capacity building processes as a team, one of which is a 1-week evaluation institute that I'll let Rebecca explain a little bit, but it runs in the summer. I've been part of another experiment called Eval Lab, which has been we've ran it now twice, and we're anticipating a third cycle, which is really a space for nonprofits to come together and build their skills around strategic learning. We also have at our disposal a whole bunch of online resources that are available to you. And if you look at the bottom there, there's actually a website as well, which is our hub website, which is a place where you can also get a lot of information. And there's another opportunity which we want to share with you too as we get close to closing out. But Rebecca, is there anything that you want to add into this list as the type of supports we provide?
Yeah, so I think too, there's us as the Evaluation Capacity Network, and we work, very closely with AMP, but AMP also has, and I think Jody had to leave because she was attending another AMP webinar. So they also have a number of resources. So I'd encourage you to check out the website that Rochelle mentioned at the beginning. In terms of coaching and mentoring and even access to support. So because we're connected to the university, we're connected to lots of courses that have practicum components specifically around research and evaluation within a community context. We'll often put kind of shout outs through our network, and we'll say, hey, are you a community-based organization? Do you need support building an evaluation framework? And there's lots of courses that are happening across the university, and we try to link up organizations to courses or student capacity to make sure that happens. So if you're interested or curious about any of that, I would encourage you to go to our website. So that's the one at the bottom there. Sign up, you can get our newsletter, maybe you're already getting it. And just kind of poke around on our website or reach out to us, because we often will work very closely with organizations and build out evaluation frameworks. We'll implement evaluations. So we're quite keen to continue to build evaluation. The course that Peter talked about is a formal course offered through the university. So for both community learners and also undergrad and graduate students. And it's a 1-week institute at the first week of June. So it's passed, it'll come again. We flipped it online. That was very exciting, but it worked out quite well. But we invite community organizations to come in, and over the course of the work, we will assign them to a team and build out a framework. So then you kind of walk away with something that you can then implement in your organization. So those are just a few of the resources, but if you've got questions, Peter and my information is at the very end, but you can also come check us out. And then the next slide, Peter.
Yeah, and we've got another great opportunity that I think builds on what Rebecca's describing. I think our spirit is really to try to meet organizations where they're at, and we are very excited about the potential of developing customized approaches and new ways of doing things. And so one of the potential opportunities that we're currently exploring that's related to the Alberta Mentoring Partnership is that we are in the process of looking at developing a capacity building training to support mentoring programs. And that we are, although we're still in the early stages of this work, what we're thinking about at the moment is that we would run a sort of focused set of workshops that would help help develop sort of an evaluation framework and help with the implementation plan for mentoring programs, and that we would be running this thing potentially over a 3-month cycle, starting sometime in late fall. We'd be likely looking at running 4-hour sort of video sessions every 2 weeks so that we can build some momentum. And we would provide some coaching in between as well. And the purpose would be to help mentoring programs develop an evaluation framework and an implementation plan. But we're still, and to give participants a chance to learn by doing. So we really want to give, it'll be more about whoever's participating, doing the work, and us supporting alongside than it will be a series of lectures. So we're still trying to figure out what that would look like. We're hoping that we would have at least some staff organization sending a staff person along, and that we would develop a carefully thought out recruitment and selection process at the front end so that we make sure that we get the right people so that you get the most value out of the process. Is there anything else you want to add to this, Rebecca, in terms of our initial thinking of this?
No, I think that's pretty good. I know we've lost some people on the call today, but Andy does have a poll because we are curious. When we've run these kind of sessions in the past, we've done it over a longer period of time and only met once a month, but we were able to meet face to face. And then we like people to go away, work on some things within the organization, come back. And we're thinking that we might intensify that with meeting more often and then having some more support and coaching in between. But we're curious to hear from you, especially in an online format. I know it can be quite exhausting. Just getting a sense for, would you prefer full days, half days, you're not sure? Yeah, so if you want to fill out the poll, and then I think we've got one other question about kind of days of week. And not assuming that you're coming to this, but just if you were to participate in something like this, what might make the most sense for you and your organization in terms of what you could commit to. So yeah, kind of trending towards half days or I'm not sure. I think that kind of makes sense if we're meeting more often. And then Andy, I think you had another poll just to find out kind of days of the week. And we should have given an option, any of the above, but just a sense of, you know, what time of week. I know that there's typically busier days than others. So when would something like this work? I'm putting my own preferences in there. We didn't put weekends, but I guess we could meet on the weekend. Sometimes people can't get away in the middle of the day from their work.
Whoa, let's see.
Oh, wow. All over the place. So we have to offer the same workshop every day of the week, Peter.
Although Wednesdays seem to get 70% of people like the middle of the week.
Interesting. That's interesting.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there seems to be a bias against Mondays and Fridays a little bit.
Yeah.
Which makes sense.
People want to have a long weekend, or they're burnt out or starting the week. So we're gonna wrap up. So there is our contact information, and we're really pleased that you joined us today and kind of stuck through the day with us. And we apologize that we got into rapid fire presenting at the end and little less engagement. But we also want to take some time right now because Peter and I would like to know what you thought of today's session, if there's other topics you're interested in learning about. So you'll notice in the chat that Andy has shared a Google link, and I know some of you may not have access to it, but Andy will likely also send out the survey again just to those participants that did attend the event. So we'd appreciate if you took a few minutes to fill that out. We'll stay online too if people have questions, but I know you're probably eager to go and figure out where you're going to go for lunch, probably your kitchen, not a restaurant. Peter, we need the map. Where's the map for the restaurant?
Yeah, I know. I need to bring it up.
It'd be a very short map to my kitchen.
Yeah. Well, the intervention now, I suppose, in that map, we would have now given people a list of, we would have given them an iPhone and told them to order skip the dishes or something.
That's right. We're giving them some lunch ideas.
Yeah.
So yeah, if anybody has any questions, Peter and I will stick around for a little bit, but we'll also just give you some space and time to fill out the survey. So maybe as people drop off, Andy and Peter, we could just stay on for a few minutes.
Sure. Yeah, that would
Sounds good.
be great.